Well, from New York to Brussels at a European Union summit on Thursday, leaders called for a pause in the fighting between Israel and Hamas in order to get aid to civilians in Gaza. A declaration issued in the past hour at the summit calls for the establishment of humanitarian corridors and pauses rather than a ceasefire. Now, the EU has been wrangling over the precise wording of the agreement for days. Yeah, the words are important. Let's bring in Jack Perrick from our Brussels bureau. He's at that summit. Jack, something of a breakthrough after the EU struggled to find a united response to the Israeli-Hamas war. What more do we know about this agreement?
Yeah, well, they've got it over the line, and I think that's pretty significant, and they will be pleased about that. What they've called for, the specific language that we're seeing, is humanitarian corridors and humanitarian pauses to get things like aid, food, medicine, water, fuel, supplies into the civilian population living in Gaza. The battle over this was about exactly what the wording would be. There was talk about a pause that has come out now as a plural of pauses. What those pauses mean, we don't actually know. Will it be a half-hour pause to get some aid in? Could it be a call for multiple days? Would the Israelis agree to do such a thing? That's one of the big questions here. But countries like Germany and Austria, for instance, will be pleased. They pretty much completely took off the table the suggestion that, for instance, Spain had said that they would call for a ceasefire. Now, for the Germans and the Austrians, and other countries as well, that was completely unacceptable because ceasefires need to be negotiated, and that would amount to a call for Israel to negotiate with Hamas, which the EU, as well as obviously Israel, denotes as a terrorist organization. Most democracies say they won't negotiate with terrorists. So what the EU is calling for, though, is some form of pauses to allow humanitarian aid to get into the people of Gaza. Countries, as I say, like Spain, also Ireland and others, are very worried about EU credibility if they weren't to have some language that called for support for the civilian plight.
Yeah, and Jack, language matters. The semantics are important here. At the end of the day, does this declaration, does it have any teeth? Does it carry any political weight?
Yeah, that really is the big question. Will a declaration like this from the European Union be able to change the minds of the Israeli government to allow these pauses? They believe that they're fighting a terrorist organization. The EU, the United States, most of the Western world believes in Israel's right to defend itself. The question is, will Israel give up even a moment to allow those aid corridors to open and those aid pauses to take place? Really, most analysts that I've spoken to understand that pressure would only come, and the diplomatic weight would only come from Washington and the United States. Whether they agree to get on board with this call from the European Union, we'll have to wait and see. But EU leaders will say that they've done what they can today to try and make sure that the people, the civilian population at least, in Gaza are able to access some humanitarian aid. That's what they want from this language in this document today.
And Jack, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, also on the agenda. I assume we're talking about tensions there as well.
Yeah, that's what we're moving on to now. The negotiations on that Middle East issue have taken 5 long and difficult hours for the leaders, and now they move on to no less difficult discussions about financial support for Ukraine. There's a €50 billion aid package on the table. Ukraine says it desperately needs additional money. Most of the European Union countries want to give that money to Ukraine. The Baltic countries are very, very insistent, obviously in the neighborhood of Russia, that the Ukraine issue isn't too far sidelined by the Middle East questions and the issues that they've been negotiating around that. But countries like Hungary and Slovakia, for instance, are seemingly prepared to prevent that €50 billion euro aid package from going to Ukraine. We saw Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban shaking hands just a few days ago with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, to the very, very strong frustration and condemnation at this summit by his fellow EU leaders.
DW's Jack Perrick with the latest from that summit in Brussels. Jack, thank you.